just to set the scene a little bit. Climate change is the greatest externality the world has ever seen. This is according to the Stern Review. By externality, we mean that it's impacting every single area of life. Most of you are students of economics, so I think you know what externality means more than I do. When we talk about Pakistan in particular, Pakistan, according to recent estimates, faces warming above the global average, between 1.3 to 4.9 degrees Celsius above the baseline, which was from 1986 to 2005. So by 2090, the temperatures in Pakistan could rise anywhere between 1.3 to 4.6 degrees. There's a lot of uncertainty around this. At the same time, this is much higher than the global average. One of the other things that we keep hearing about is that this rise in temperature is actually maybe not even going to be an average rise. It's going to be a rise in the minimum temperatures and in the maximum temperatures. So colder days are going to get colder and hotter days are going to get hotter. This obviously has a lot of implications for every single sector. This has implications for crops, this has implications for livelihoods, this has implications for water availability. You name it, and every sector has been impacted by it. And of course, the frequency and intensity of extreme climate events is expected to increase. So the vulnerable poor, particularly minority groups and those who are most exposed to climate change, are going to be most at risk from this. There is a projected increase in the number of people affected by flooding and an increase of about 5 million people exposed to extreme river floods between 2035 to 2044, and an increase of about 1 million annually exposed to coastal flooding between 2070 to 2100. Um, and this is all not just talk. The keynote address earlier also mentioned that Pakistan is already experiencing this. I don't have to tell all of you how the floods of 2022 have left 1/3 of the country in water and thousands of people dead, and people are still suffering and coming to terms with the scale of the disaster. And as a direct consequence of the flood, according to the Post Disaster Needs Assessment, the national poverty rate will increase by between 3.7 to 4.0%. What this means is that between 8.4 to 9.1 additional million people will be pushed into poverty. So these people were not under the poverty line before, but they will be now as a consequence of climate change. So the purpose of saying all of this is to highlight that climate change is a mammoth challenge and no single institute, no single body can handle it by itself. In many cases, governments, civil society, academia, and private sector are collaborating, but is this collaboration and partnership enough to come out with tangible outcomes? That's something we're going to be exploring today. In terms of all of these actors, some of them lack the resources, some of them lack the knowledge, and some of them, in fact, all of them lack the connectivity with each other. I'm very happy to have with us all of these panelists that I'm just going to invite to the stage, and they're going to help us unpack what partnership actually means and share some experiences on how it's worked and what needs to be done in the future. I'd like to invite Ms. Miriam Kugeli, the Global Senior Manager, Environment and Sustainability at the Aga Khan University, to please come and have a seat. There's also, we're very pleased to have with us Mr. Wakar, who is the program lead at Anthro Insights, who will also be joining us as a panelist today. Mr. Ali Shah, the head of research at the NUST Institute of Policy Studies, if you could please join us on stage as a panelist. And Ms. Elia Naqvi, who is the managing editor of CSCR, if you could please join us on stage. Thank you. We have two other panelists that we're expecting, Dr. Imran Khalid, who is the Director of Policy and Governance at WWF, and we also have Ms. Maheen Zera from the Oxford Policy Management Institute. I think that they will be joining us a little bit late. So thank you again to the panelists for joining us. We're really looking forward to your insights. Miriam, of yesterday, I'm going to start with you. Yesterday, we were having a short discussion, and just now also, about the work that AKU as a university, as someone from academia, has been doing on net zero decarbonization and research on also, obviously, since AKU is very heavily invested in the health sector, that's what they're known for. So from a health perspective, um, do you feel like there's a genuine demand for partnership, or do you think that, with the resources and with the expertise that AKU has, it can possibly, it doesn't really need to partner with anyone? And then how, and I know that you have had some experiences partnering with various organizations. How did these partnerships come about? And what were some of the outcomes of partnering with different stakeholders in the sector?
Those are three very complex questions. So I'll try to only speak for a few minutes, I suppose. Thank you also for inviting me to this panel. It's going to be wonderful to hear from everyone and learn together, because that's really what it is about. So partnerships in the climate realm, first and foremost, are about learning and raising the ambition, right? Raising the ambition towards net zero, to achieve what the world has committed, which is 1.5 or maximum 2 degrees warming. And we all know that it needs all stakeholders to do so. We can't wait for countries to act and policy to be ready. We can't wait for technology, because, as we heard this morning, technology is ready. So we need to collaborate, right, in order to move forward. So is there demand? Absolutely. In particular, there's demand for learnings from the global south or from low and middle income countries. Because technology, learnings, implementation, structures cannot easily be transferred from one place to the next, be it from the north to the south or the other way around, right? So we need to innovate over here, and we need to share that in order to enable other actors within the so-called global south to raise ambition and increase action. Is there a need from our side? Well, it'd be for a university a bit of a limiting thing to say we're not going to, collaborate just because we're represent a well-known name. And yes, the Arahan University has expertise and really has moved the front on many things, especially in healthcare, now also increasingly in teacher education and many other realms. But on the climate and environment front, again, the need for collaboration is always going to be there. We can't do it alone. The targets even are not even set by us, right? They're set by the world. So of course there is a need to collaborate with others, be it in the health sector, be it with universities, be it with government or many other stakeholders. So your third question was around experience and how did some of the collaborations and partnerships come about? And I want to structure this really quickly along three levels. So global, national, and more local. So on the global front, we've started collaboration with a number of global forums for sharing knowledge and raising ambition, including the World Health Organization, which has a forum now called the Alliance for Transformative Action on Climate and Health, where all kind of various health actors and academia are coming together to discuss, what does net zero mean in our various parts of the operation. But there's also university-specific forums, such as, for example, through SDSN, the Sustainable Development Solutions Network, where again AKU is actually the node for Pakistan, where we're collaborating with many other academic institutions locally and globally to share and act. On the national level, I mean, it's really about raising the ambition together, right? And I'm so glad that we're here at NUST today. And hopefully we'll speak to many of you in the course of today and tomorrow about what universities can do together. Universities, in the end of the day, are our think tanks of our countries and globally, right? But that also really means that we shouldn't go with this alone. I find it really important to actually be aligned to national plans and national targets, maybe the NDCs, and really see how does our institution's action really align with what the country is doing. Let's not go it alone. And I'll take the one example from AKU, let's say, for example, in terms of flood response, right? AKU is very, very active, in particular in Sindh. And so throughout the last half a year, we've been very involved in flood response and are now designing a bit more of a way forward to really build resilience. So it's not just response, it's resilience building for a maybe uncertain climatic future and everything that entails. Also nationally, we're working with our suppliers, right? So in healthcare, we have a ginormous supply chain. But being a university and therefore this kind of think tank or node, we're sharing our learning of what it means to decarbonize, what it means to calculate what it'll cost, what it means to develop a plan forward, etc., with our suppliers to actually say, yes, it is possible, and yes, we can go it together. And then really just quickly to conclude, I wanted to mention this internal kind of layer or local level. So even within the university, partnerships need to be fostered in order to bring this work forward. The work we do in climate and sustainability is not hierarchical, the way that normally institutions and academia also operate. It is absolutely horizontal. And that is a very unusual way of working anywhere in the world for that matter, right? And so this kind of collaboration between academic entities, between procurement, between finance, between HR, between our office and so many others is a new way of working. And that's innovative, right? And it takes time and it takes um, a lot of belief that it's doable, right? And again, that is worth sharing between us as partners here in here in the room today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Miriam. That was very insightful. And I'm going to shift to Wakar for a minute here because some of the points that you raised about, how it's a very horizontal landscape in Pakistan at the moment. Wakar was just telling me a little bit about how he's been working with policymakers and building their capacity. So, Wakar, from that perspective, from the work that you and your organization have been doing with policymakers, do you think that there is a genuine demand for partnership from that end? So we do know that for academia and civil society, it is important to be working with the government. But what do you think is their perspective, and what are some of the gaps? Why is it so difficult for us to achieve this partnership if it's what everyone wants at the end of the day?
Thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me. Uh, Before starting this, just one thing that we all have to recognize that the parliamentarians throughout the world, they are not someone who are subject specialist or technical people. They are the people who are good at speech and communicating with the people and connecting with them. Um, Considering that climate change is a very diverse topic. We covered forest, we covered environment, we covered water resources. There's a lot of areas in which we use in the climate change. Considering that we as a academia, civil society, and think tanks, and people like us, who they are the one who set the directions for the parliamentarians and help them out on which areas we need to cover. I wanted to share a case study that we have been working with the National Assembly and Provincial Assembly, especially with the Standing Committee on the Climate Change. What we did was we initiated a full project on connecting the academia and civil society with the parliament. So we started with the consultation with them. A lot of Professor Dr. Salman, Dr. Fahim from NUST, they were the part of this panel. So what we did, we drived a complete agenda for the next 4 years. Like what is the area the government needs to work on, what should be the priority on the climate change, like should we consider the international commitments to be reviewed again, either we need to work on the water resources. So that was a very extensive consultation. After the consultations, we invited all of them to be the part of the pool of expert. So then we have a complete agenda after the consultation, and after having the pool of expert, the pool of expert contains more than 70s expert in different fields related to climate change. Uh, then the committee started calling different meetings on different topics. I will be sharing about the nation determined contribution, the first NDC of Paris Agreement. So what we did, we asked all the pool of experts to help out the committee to review the first NDCs and then provide the recommendation for the second NDC that was due in 2021. But I'm really sorry to say, in mm, these 70s pool of experts from academia and civil society, only two of them give the response to the recommendation as well. So the gap was there. the parliament is trying to connect with the academia and civil society, and the academia itself is very welcoming. But when it's come towards the communicating about the research, about how to present that research, how that their research and their data can be utilized by the parliamentarians, that gap is still missing in case of that. I think, considering that parliamentarians have issues of capacity, they have issues of resources, they have issues of time, because they have a lot of other things going on, and it's very difficult to asking them and expecting from them to be just focused on one thing. So I think institutionalizing the processes, institutionalizing these connections is one of the challenge. In last 3 years I have seen that that's still missing. We need to work with the academia, we need to work with the parliament, and we need to finalize a mechanism on how we can be connect on one platform. As she mentioned about the technology, I think technology is a very important thing that we can utilize that, and using technology we can better connect them, the academia and civil society, with the parliament and with the government.
Thank you so much, Ricardo. And thank you for being so candid about it as well. Sometimes we do have these committees in place, we do have these groups in place that are there to maybe fill the gaps as far as parliamentarians are gone, but are concerned. But people don't necessarily have the time or the inclination to really be providing input into national policy, or building the capacity of parliamentarians. And sometimes, from my personal experience, this can be because of time constraints, but also because somehow it is expected to provide this kind of developmental capacity building for free, whereas it should be remunerated. People should be remunerated for their time for being part of these committees. I'm going to move on to Elia. So we've talked a little bit about, the partnership perspective from the national lens, and we've spoken a little bit about academia and about the parliamentarians. Maybe we can zoom out a little bit and talk a little bit about partnership, and how does this look in an increasingly polarized world, and especially if you look at it from an international relations perspective. We're seeing that there are very high emitters in low emitting countries like Pakistan. They're very low emitters in high emitting countries. So there's a lot of polarities, there's a lot of disparity, and that makes partnership difficult, in my opinion. So I'd like to hear from you about what your opinion is on this.
Am I audible, Anam? Assalamu alaikum, and a very good afternoon to all those present here. Before I start, I'd like to thank NUST and Amira in particular for inviting me and for organizing this wonderful 3-day event. So, with reference to the questions, the very important questions that Anam just wanted me to address, I think I will look at the significance of, thank you. I will look at the significance of partnership for climate action in developing countries, and I will look at why this is important and the role that the developed countries are playing in sort of assisting a partnership for climate action for developing countries. And then I'd also like to address how developing countries can benefit by partnering with each other, which is also known as the South-South cooperation. Um, we all know that developing countries are disproportionately impacted or affected by the impacts of climate change, such as rising sea levels, frequent and intense natural disasters, changes in precipitation patterns that can impact agriculture, food security, even though developing countries do not substantially contribute to the greenhouse gas emissions. Um, if we just look at the Global Climate Risk Index, the top 10 countries that have suffered most from extreme weather events from the years 2000 to 2019, that is roughly about 2 decades, are all developing countries that are located in the global south. Um, Contrarily, we know that the highest emissions are actually from US, EU countries, Russia, and many others. But 80% of the people that are most vulnerable to climate change are actually residing in Africa. So, this is an important issue as developing countries often lack the resources and the capacity to respond to challenges posed by climate change. And then we see that climate change directly impacts sustainable development. Um, Particularly so in developing countries where the impacts can hinder economic growth and undermine social and economic progress. When we are looking at rising temperatures, we are looking at losses just in developing countries of around 290 to 580 billion dollars, and this is expected by 2030. And these are just economic losses. We are not talking about non-economic losses in these figures. So, just in Pakistan's context, environmental degradation and climate related events are projected to reduce Pakistan's gross domestic product by 18 to 20% by 2050. So, rising temperatures are expected to lower GDPs in both developed and developing countries, but we are looking at more pronounced impacts in developing countries. Another impact or another aspect that is often ignored is the nexus that exists between climate change and conflict. Climate change places additional burden on institutions in fragile countries, weakening their ability to respond to internal and external threats. Hence, uh, partnership for climate action is very important, particularly so as developing countries are financially under-resourced and require technical technical and resource assistance from advanced economies and international organizations. So, what is being done in this regard? What is the role that the developed countries play in partnering for climate action within developing countries? There are several multilateral and bilateral environmental assistance programs that are currently providing funding initiatives to promote, let's say, renewable energy or even protecting biodiversity, etc. And examples for these could be projects under the World Bank, um, projects under the Green Climate Fund, the African Development Bank, etc. However, even though the global north acknowledges its responsibility for the climate crisis, even though that it acknowledges that it is going to solve uh, the issue of climate crisis through the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities. All these initiatives by the developed world are lacking implementation, they are lacking coordination, and most importantly, they lack political will. If you just look at the recent COP27, it took these rich countries around 31 years to finally just agree to a loss and damage fund. And we are talking about them just agreeing. Uh, this does not mean that they will eventually or they will actually compensate. So the situation is quite um, grim at the moment. Some of the areas that I feel where partnership is important for developing countries are early warning systems, climate smart agriculture, water conservation programs, and even solutions to affordable and clean technologies. Um, Early warning systems play a very significant role in avoiding and reducing losses and damages. Unfortunately, majority of the Met departments in the developing countries um, do not meet the international standards and lack the capacity for effective early detection. So we do have organizations such as USAID that are working in this direction, but still there are huge funding gaps, and there's a lot of scope in this area. Secondly, Um, Advanced economies and international organizations can play a key role in providing technical and financial assistance to implement climate smart agriculture. When we talk about climate smart agriculture, we are referring to optimizing land use, we are referring to effective management of water, drought resistant crops, etc. And we already see that the World Bank is sponsoring community supported agricultural initiatives. Mm, Additionally, I think investing in water conservation programs by introducing technology to recycle water and cut down waste is also very important. Developed countries can also help construct infrastructure for water storage and for irrigation methods. Uh, Finally, incentivizing the adoption of clean energy is yet another important area. Global companies can distribute solutions on affordable and clean technologies to developing regions. They can fund organizations such as Green Climate Fund, which exclusively work to support least developed countries in generating renewable energy and improving energy efficiency. Lastly, I think I'd like to just briefly touch upon how the developing countries can benefit from partnering with each other, which is also known as the South-South cooperation. Firstly, it is very important that in order to achieve their sustainable development goals, climate adaptation is at the center of national development plans. Developing countries need to support each other to raise financial resources and also build technological capacities and capabilities so that they can enhance and complement the North-South um, cooperation through this South-South partnership. By synergizing their efforts, they can strengthen the voice of developing countries at international climate negotiations and increase the impact of their climate partnership. Um, and through knowledge sharing and expertise sharing, they can also utilize the strengths of each other. Um, Lastly, the Global South can also build a network among its universities and research institutions to facilitate the transfer of green technologies. So, I'd just like to conclude by saying that partnerships for climate action are critical for advancing collective actions and collective efforts to address climate change. By pooling their resources, sharing their expertise, and working together, um, developing countries can achieve greater impact and promote a more sustainable future. Thank you.
Thank you, Elia, for a very comprehensive presentation. I'd like to shift to Mr. Ali Shah, who is the head of research for policy at NUST. Mr. Well, I'm going to call you Ali. I'm going to tilt back to academia from where this conversation started and where one of the premier universities of Pakistan today. Just out of curiosity, as someone who has been working in the climate policy space for so many years, I'd like to ask whether do you think that there's a genuine demand for sustainable development and climate policy related research? Or is it donor driven is my question. And my second question is actually, have you had any experiences with some of your policy work that you've been heading here actually being used to influence real policy in the country or maybe internationally? If you could share some success stories, that would be great.
Thank you very much, Anam. I'm grateful to you for giving me a chance to voice some of my very provisional views because in a domain as vast and as uh, deep and mediated as climate action, climate change, they cannot be ultimate views. I'm grateful to NUST as well, especially the Prorectorate of Research, Innovation and Commercialization at NUST for allowing me to be a part of this panel. You have asked, can you hear me? Yeah. In fact, you have posed very thorny questions to me, and I'll try to deal with them as best as possible. Uh, I personally think the potential for partnerships at different tiers, whether it's domestic, local, domestic, regional, or global, is exceptionally high. But the prospects, the actual concrete prospects for global partnerships in climate action uh, is faced with a lot of challenges. One of the challenges is the very construct under which the world works, and which is the construct of hypermodernity. Uh, this construct thinks of itself and the way it functions, that this construct is the best of all possible constructs, and there is but no alternative to looking at the world except through the lens of modernity or hypermodernity. uh, this way of looking at the world, this way of being in the world, this way of doing things in the world has been dominant for at least the last 200 years, if not uh, older. I personally think that the world right now is not in a good shape, and nobody can be specifically blamed for it. This is part of being uh, human. It is one of the inevitable wages of our human condition, but it can be made better. But will it be made better is a question that needs to be posed to people who make policy and different kinds of policies at different levels, from the locality through the city to the state to the world at large. Uh, I think we need to take a traditional approach towards climate adaptation and mitigation. This approach is not conservative. It is just that it looks at the world in a way in which, let's say, ancients used to look at it, in the way in which, let's say, a Plato or a Socrates or an Ibn Khaldun or Ibn Sina would have looked at it. This means that there are non-modern ways of doing things which are, or maybe in their orientation, as advanced as the ways, or rather more settled than the ways of hypermodernity. So this is my first intervention. One of the leading geniuses of modern European or Western philosophy, who went by the name of Professor Alfred White, uh, North Whitehead. He was a collaborator of Dr. Bertrand Russell, who won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1950, and who was known for his pioneering work in anti-nuclear collisions, and hence with strong implications for environment uh, and climate change, which was not a debate at that time in the way it is framed now. So he said that perhaps the safest thing that you could say about European philosophy, and European philosophy basically a general term for the knowledge and negotiation of being in the Western world, which is the dominant way of doing and looking at the world. So he said the safest thing that could be said about it, that it is a series of footnotes to the philosophy of Plato. So they are gems in ancient classical philosophy which need to be resuscitated in order for us to look at the world in a more well-informed and in a more empathetic, or if we can't do that, in a more sympathetic manner. There are three meta tendencies, in my view, which are the biggest stumbling block in the way of mounting effective uh, climate action partnerships at any level. The reality is one, but it has many manifestations. So, in the world of economy, this manifests itself in the tendency of the bottom line, profit maximization. And the way economy at different levels is organized shows us that there are three leading circuits in which investment in business takes place. So the first or primary circuit of investment or capital, as non-neoclassical thinkers would look at reality. So the primary circuit of investment deals with production of commodities, goods, and their consumption, whether it's taking place in Islamabad or in San Francisco or in New York or in Tokyo or Beijing. Uh, the second circuit of investment looks at taking care of what is called infrastructure or locked or fixed capital. The third circuit consists of actions which are carried out by the state, by not-for-profit or non-profit sector in the realm of social expenditures and research and development. So the way these three circuits are wired, uh, I would say foreclose any concrete possibility for long-term, sustained, and well-funded, and I would say, if not well-intentioned, then well-coordinated climate action partnership. One of the reasons that these circuits do not, at least the primary circuit of investment does not appear to us, because for that part of the world which is called the advanced part of the world, this circuit uh, is basically heavily outsourced to other parts of the world. And I'm not making a moral or value judgment here. This outsourcing has contributed a lot to economic success stories around the world. But one of the reasons that the problems with this primary circuit are not visible to those parts of the world which have the resources in different sectors to deal with the climate action is because this is removed from the everyday existential reality. And in those parts of the world where this is outsourced, it is also removed uh, even farther. You would not find a smokestack phenomenon or a smokestack factory right in the middle of prosperous third world suburban living. So this invisibility of these three primary circuits, especially the primary circuit of investment, contributes to our lackadaisical reaction to climate change and the dangers that it poses. One of my co-panelists pointed out a key contradiction. I call it one of the series of inversions with which this world is faced. And he said that they have to do a lot of capacity building for policymakers. Well, one should be a policymaker only when they have capacity. But the world over, you, you want capacity after you've become a policymaker. So this is a series of inversion to which I'm coming. So the second stumbling block exists in the world of politics. And in this world, what I call the animal spirits of conflict and the drive for interstate competition trumps all other considerations. I mean, look at the world right now. Russia-Ukraine war, US-China competition, traditional long-standing great power politics, and a slew and a raft of sticking points and issues among and between great powers, regional powers, middle powers, and small powers are going to continue to deflect focus from more urgent existential issues. So, and at the same time, we have to realize that state is one of the uh, most effective artifacts, constructs, or inventions of human civilization. So unless states in different parts of the world take lead in dealing with climate action, horizontality of action is going to be effective up till a certain point. Uh, and perhaps the third, and in my estimation, the greatest stumbling block is the one that exists in culture. And I'm not thinking of culture in a specific manner, culture of a certain locality. I'm thinking of culture in a more ecumenical, universal manner. Uh, and I would refer here to a masterpiece of the 1980s, a book which goes by the name of The Chalice and the Blade, written by Dr. Rianne Eisler. It's an eye-opening account of how things have progressively gone wrong in the case of human civilization. So she talks of two kinds of culture, a dominator culture and a partnership culture. So uh, this uh, framework of this book says that dominator culture basically is based on domination hierarchies. What are domination hierarchies? Domination hierarchies are hierarchies where people are more concerned with ranking one another over one another. And the other kind of culture is called functional hierarchies. What are functional hierarchies? These are hierarchies which are created solely for the express purpose of individuals, people, and organizations going from the lower to higher stages of progression, perfection, and skills. So the problem occurs insofar as climate change is concerned. The problem is that science belongs to the world of functional hierarchies. Decision making belongs to the world of domination hierarchies. There is not much reconciliation between the two for those people who do actual climate science. And I'm not a climate scientist, nor am I a climate activist. I am just a humble student of geopolitics and how it impacts and crisscrosses with state and development. So I personally think if you ask climate scientists, they would narrate the challenges that they have faced in allowing the world to look at the state of affairs as it is, and it's pretty dim, which does not mean that it cannot be fixed. It can be fixed, but beyond a certain time, it will not be fixed. So at that time, it will be a situation of humanity is already gone. It's just that we don't realize it yet. So that time has not come, but the clock is ticking. So this is something that we have to focus. Uh, a question of gathering enough willpower was discussed and highlighted during the keynote session, and one of the keynote speakers talked about the absence of will. One of my co-panelists also talked about lack of willpower. While at one level the problem appears to be a lack of willpower, uh, but I personally think it's not so much a question of lack of willpower as it is the question of a preferential and a differential investment of willpower. There's a lot of willpower in the world. I'm tell you, I'm telling you, and so we have seen it in different spheres in our own public existence as well. The question is that this willpower is invested in these three meta tendencies that I have just shared with you, the wrongly wired three circuits or differently wired three circuits of economy, the dominant trend of politics, and the dominant trend of human culture. So we need to address these things. I also think that it's not possible in any public culture for researchers or, let's say, think tank specialists and activists to impact state actions or policy making instantaneously. The progress is cumulative, and in countries which are suffering from different tiers and levels of challenges, this progress is even slow. This progress is humble, even in countries of the advanced West or countries of the semi-periphery, by which I mean the newly industrialized countries like Turkey or China or other countries. There's no point mentioning those countries. The world over, it's the efforts of researchers, scientists, and specialists to influence their policymakers is always a humble one. It's because policymakers belong to the best part of humanity. Their concerns sometimes are far advanced of the concerns of normal human beings, which means that they are looking at those ways of doing things which common people can't look at. So perhaps this difference in insight and this difference in way of looking things basically makes them less impervious to what scientists or researchers, thinkers, or philosophers have to say. And not every country is lucky from time to time, like Germany was. I mean, look at they got Dr. Angela Merkel. It's not every day that you get an academic specialist as the head of the state. The second thing is that the key thing right now is that we need seriousness at different levels of governance. The macro, which is the level of the state, the meso, which is the level of the region and the city, and the local, which is the level micro, which is the level of individual human beings, neighborhoods, communities. Uh, for a country like Pakistan, I think city authorities need to wake up to this challenge, and they need to expand their role beyond the very important but still peripheral to climate change aspect of real estate development and property development and making their cities look beautiful. The cities have to be livable. So we have to go beyond that stage. And I think a lot can be learned from the specialization in sociology and economy, which is now almost a discipline in its own right, and that is the subject of urban studies. We need to go and refer to insights of people like Richard Norton, who coined the concept of feral cities, and we need to know what is the spectrum on which a city becomes feral from being healthy. So our policymakers, or at least our researchers, need to be aware of the valuable insights of urban studies, sociology, anthropology, history, and philosophy. And an integrated perspective should be taken to policymakers in a manner that can be easily digested and easily actioned. And that is where the catch is. It's not that easy. So we don't have answers to all the questions, but in my estimation, these three stumbling blocks in the state, the economy, and the culture stand in the way of not only climate action partnership, but any kind of partnership in any sphere. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was very insightful. And one of the takeaways that we're getting from that, listening to you was relying on people's moral imperative or policymakers' moral imperative to address the climate challenge isn't going to be enough. Even in the case of Pakistan, we've seen concrete action only when it resulted in impacts on the economy. That's when our policymakers actually started to sit up and take action on climate change or demand this loss and damage facility or whatever. So um, maybe that's the angle that we should be looking at it from. Miriam, I'd like to turn to you. I mean, you've been taking a lot of notes, so you're welcome to comment on anything that the previous panelists have said. But I also wanted to pick up on something that Ali was talking about in terms of, the private sector and the economy and the role that they play in it. And for climate activists, or people working in this space, it's always been a slightly contentious subject. You do want the private sector on the table when you're negotiating at the international level, at the national level also, but at the same time it's also heavily criticized when you do have a private sector actor in the room, because you know that they have the money and that they might be influencing policy to go into their direction. So what are your thoughts, and especially from an institute that is primarily dealing with healthcare, where you have a lot of interface with the private sector? How do you feel about partnering with the private sector for climate action?
Thanks. Yeah, so I think there is no question about having to partner with the climate sector, the private sector. To me, this whole discussion about how difficult it is, and yes, it's difficult, no matter between what kinds of actors, is not a question of direction. We know where we need to go, right? So the world knows its goals in terms of decarbonization, right? They've been well defined and acknowledged by our countries. That's our highest level actors. And so if we all were just to, have the same goals and actually follow those, it wouldn't be so complicated. So in terms of decarbonization or climate mitigation at large, this is really well defined. How much does every actor, whether it's a household, whether it's an institution, whether it's a country, or any actor in between, need to decarbonize their emissions by what date? It's very well defined. And the most ambitious targets are the SBTI ones, and so you follow them. So net zero then doesn't become some loose term. Right? It's actually very clear where you start by doing your carbon accounting, and it's very clear, you can very much draw a path forward how to get to net zero, right? Or in terms of biodiversity, right, and the natural environment. Last year, countries agreed in Montreal about the 30-30-30 goals, right? 30% of land, 30% of oceans to be put into reserves. And again, that's very well defined what that means by 2030. So our goals are clear, right? The benchmark is clear. And that's where the partnership then comes in, right? So we don't go that path alone, right? Maybe, you know, one institution's piece of land doesn't provide for that amount of biodiversity or something or land to be protected. So you partner and figure it out how to do it. But there's no greenwashing then, right? Which is half of the problem. Because if you don't, like everybody can say, oh, net zero something, everybody can say carbon neutral. Frankly, most of us don't even know what the difference is or if there is a difference, right? And so, I mean, that would be one of my recommendations, to kind of think of for us just that we actually have a shared goal and it shouldn't be too difficult.
Thank you for that little ray of hope, Miriam. For another thing that I was actually struck by that Ali mentioned in his comments was to do with policymakers before they become policymakers. Essentially, should have some background or knowledge or something. Bakar is someone who's working closely with them. What do you think? How do you react to something, to a statement like that?
uh, I think the debate can go very long if we talk about that, considering that the Pakistan, the political system is very different as comparatively if we uh, compare it with the developed world. So the issues are there. The parliamentarians have other priorities. They think that गली पक्की करना उनका शायद काम है as a legislator. They think that maybe that's how. I think it's not their fault. It is something that is being expect from them as a people like us who expect that that they will be doing all the constructions. They will be looking over do the but we don't force them to focus on issues like global issues like climate change. When the flood was here, no one is talking about how we are planning for the long term, how we gonna when the next year flood will be here, what we gonna do about that. But no one is forcing them to focus on that. No one is asking NDMA what they have plans for the mitigation and adaptation. Is there we have any adaptation plan for that? No one is asking one. Everyone is asking that what we gonna get from the other world. imdad kis tarah ki aa rahi hai, all the things we are asking all of that. So I think I do agree with her. The the work plans are there, the agendas are there, the whole keys areas are being defined, whole responsibilities are being defined. If we take international commitments, if we take all the policies, all everyone's responsibilities is being defined. It's our responsibility. Academia should take their responsibility, policies makers should take their responsibilities, donors should take their responsibilities, civil society and other thematic experts should take their responsibility. And as a whole, when they uh, uh, they take that agenda, they take one goal, definitely there will be a result for that.
Thank you, Wakar. With that, I'm going to open the floor for questions. Amira has the mic. Okay, fine. We're going to take two questions at a time. And I'd like to request the audience if you could, please, there's someone here who wants to ask. If we're just going to take two questions at a time, I'd really like to request you to please keep the questions short, so we have time to entertain many people. And it would also be very good if you could introduce yourself briefly and then also say who the question is for. That would make it easy for us. So two questions at a time. Sir, please go ahead.
So is there two for me or it's just one for me?
You can ask two, Dr. Fahim, it's fine.
Okay, that's me, Dr. Fahim Coker from NUST. So trying to investigate climate change impact in Pakistan. So rightly mentioned by the panelist, actually. So there is a huge disparity and disharmony among the various stakeholders. It's not just the parliamentarian, it's also the government organizations and even the NGOs and all. So my first comment is actually, so in principle, the academia and the R&D institutes, they are actually the driving forces in the mechanism. So they are uh, identifying the solution, and they are devising the solution for that, identifying the problem and devising the solution for that. But unfortunately, here there's total disconnectivity among all these stakeholders. So the first, for all the panelists, actually, particularly the lady sitting over there from GSD. So what could be the way forward that this harmony can be generated among these stakeholders, like academic institutes, R&D, they could be at a driving seat for identifying problem and their solution, and their feedback should be taken by NGOs and also by INGOs and also by the government organization as well for devising policy and for policy feedback mechanism actually, which is the main missing puzzle, a brick in the puzzle actually. And uh, there was one comment that the capacity of the parliamentarian should be there. Unfortunately, this is rightly mentioned by the Vakar that we lack in this area largely. But there's no harm having politician with a strong specialized background in certain areas. So we should foster this culture in our political parties and in our socioeconomic circles as well. So there a huge need of specialists that should be specialized from the very beginning, going even in the bureaucracy. The bureaucracy shouldn't be staying in one department for few years or few months. Rather, they will stick to one line for the longer time period. Their capacity should be built, and they can better understand our problem in indigenous situation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Coker. Like always, it's a pleasure to listen to your comments. And it was wonderful to work with you on the NUST climate panel, a true example of peer learning that I experienced working with you. I think since this whole debate is taking place in the premier university of Pakistan, I would focus on the role of universities in generating enough interest uh, and value propositions for different stakeholders to come together. Uh, this phrase is already pretty hackneyed in the developing world, but I'm going to use this phrase for want of any better. And this phrase is called the triple helix model of collaboration, one of the most hackneyed phrases in public cultures in the developed world. But if we actually go back to the uh, corpus of Henry Etchkovist, the theorist who created or who coined the term, in his, I think, 2000, in his 2008 or 2007 book, which is the eponymous book on the phenomenon, he mentions two kinds of functions of two different kinds of stakeholders. One function he calls regional innovation organizers, and the other function he designates sorry, regional innovation initiator. So he assigns the roles of putting people together, creating a platform, and doing it without any bottom line profit maximization concern to the basket or to the bucket of responsibilities of regional innovation organizers. So leading universities in any region or a country or locality can eminently play the role of regional innovation organizers, but without any bottom line. But what would you do in an institutional context where bottom line is what is haunting the universities themselves? Which means that there needs to be some degree of liberal funding assured to universities for them to play their role of RIO in order to fuel and operationalize the triple helix for the economy as a whole to become productive and innovative. So universities can play this role. Until that, I think uh, uh, optimistic silver lining in the sky of some assurance of funding is there, universities will have to do it selflessly, and they should continue to engage with stakeholders. And I know it is a very challenging thing, and for me, a convenient thing to say, but I have been in the field of public policy uh, in different capacities for the last 16 plus years. So I know it's very difficult for any stakeholder to play a certain role selflessly, but in exceptional circumstances, I think this selflessness becomes one of the strongest spiritual resources of individuals, institutions, and organizations. There are two ways of approaching a problem. One is to approach it with liberal resources, and the other, liberal material resources, and the other is to approach it from strong, moral, intangible resources viewpoint. And if you look at the trajectory of development of countries like Turkey, South Korea, China, Japan, and once again, these examples are cliched, but we can't do without these examples at the same time. When these countries started developing in the initial phase of their development, which lasted anywhere from 10 to 20 years, these countries started with an abundance of, if you could call it, spiritual, moral, or intangible resources of getting things done. So leading universities will have to play the role of RIOs, regional innovation organizers, make their excellent convening capabilities available for different kinds of stakeholders to come together routinely. It will be challenging, but not impossible. The second role that Henry Eschkowitz identifies in his book, an exceptional read, is regional innovation initiators. These are those entities which have the moolah, the dough necessary to get the wheels of innovation rolling, to make partnerships happen. So universities will always have to find some way of engaging with these entities. And I think initiatives like science parks, high technology development zones, and I think NUST is distinguished in the sense that it has the first truly proper science and technology park hosted by university in Pakistan, NSTP. A lot of sweat and blood has gone into it, and it's yielding results. So these anchor institutions are there for RIOs to attract and provide an actionable platform to RIIs. So state and business should be attracted, or should be at least focused minimally enough to recognize the importance of initiatives like this, and not bring the far-flung and far-fetched arguments of national development and human development to very immediate institutions like NSTP. A policy making asking a certain university how its science park is going to contribute to human development or social development, or better life and learning outcomes for its youth, is a far-fetched question. These anchor institutions are there for innovation to take place. And it is a link in the chain, it's not the chain itself. So their immediacy has to be recognized and cherished and resourced, rather than throwing these far-flung policy questions like projectiles at these institutes and initiatives and killing their potential. Thank you.
Maybe I can comment.
Go ahead, please,
Yeah,
Zuka.
thank you. I want to share that Dr. Fahim was the part of that very extensive consultation when we were developing a knowledge hub for the climate change committee. That was the roadmap for that. That what we did was created a pool of expert in which we have a lot of professors from the NUST who has been the part of this pool. So, as sir mentioned, the one of the challenge that we are facing right now is institutionalizing that whole concept with the parliament and with the government. The problem is that we are someone who are donors, who are from development sector, who are just building that. But once we are on the back foot and get out of that, the whole setup, the whole system collapse again. So no one is ready to take the willing to take it up and to keep the connection with the academia, with the civil society, and with the thematic expert. So I think this is the challenge that we we, as academia and everyone have to think about that, how we can make it as a permanent part with the parliament, with the institutions, with the government, how we can we can come up that their research, your research, academia's research can be better utilized uh, in an important topic like climate change. So we need to think about how we can work on that.
Please go ahead and maybe also the Dr. Fahim's question about how can we foster harmony? How can we foster, an environment where partnerships can thrive? Maybe.
I think that, I mean, just like Mr. Alisha discussed, universities are very important. I feel like think tanks are also very important in this. Um, Earlier, we saw under the strategic planning policy cell under the national security division that all these think tanks that were also not directly funded by the government were taken on board regarding policy inputs, and that was, I think, for the first time, I felt was a great initiative to get on board organizations that are not directly under the government. However, we see a change in the government, and then again it goes back to how it has been. So I guess we need more such initiatives where think tanks that are funded not by the government are also included in policy making, and sort of taken on board when it comes to policy inputs. Thank you.
I think we have.
I have the
Please
mic.
go
So
ahead.
thank you. So I'm Dr. Vikas. I come from Namal. I teach public policy. So I have two questions. One from you. You spoke about. I mean, it's glad to know about that. This is shared goal. We keep on reading that. The question is on two fronts. One is that do you think that the international frameworks, the corporations, do we have the enough enablers to fulfill those goals and the shared agenda, keeping the polarization in politics, keeping the how world is divided, and keeping the, see, we need to understand that this industrialization and the this development has certain cost, and the people, have suffered from that. So do you think there should be debate on the accountability of factor of this as well, because we have to restore the trust of the people as well, because world has been agreeing on a lot of things in past, but it didn't happen. So it's also restoring the trust of the people on that account. On the second, on Pakistan's front, I mean, you've been talking about parliamentarians and legislator. I mean, of course, we have the issues of policy capacity in Pakistan, but don't you think that there is a greater disconnect between the people who have suffered and people who are talking about these all things? One fine morning, we are telling them, look, we are coming here with some donors of the projects, and we are trying to teach you how to live. I mean, you have to change, you have to adapt the situations. They are not the primary people who are responsible for creating these all things. One of the fine debate that is missing in Pakistan is about the creation of local bodies institution. At the end of the day, it's not a donor-driven project works. We deeply appreciate we are taking it at global level, cooperation, all these things. But in this partnership, do you think there is a debate in Pakistan that until unless you don't have effective, empowered, purely decentralized local government system evolving out of the people, you can't communicate and build that trust with the communities on the climate change? Thank you.
Thanks. I'll go to the first part of that question about enablers, accountability, and trust. So probably we don't have enough enablers, otherwise we'd be living in a slightly different world, right? And wouldn't see quite as much of the climate change impacts. But I think there's really wonderful, I'll take this at an institutional and at an individual level. There's really wonderful institutions in the world that connect science and policy, or science and action, or action and policy, or action and corporates, and different kind of entities. I don't want to name a few because I can't endorse any of them personally, or don't want to pick out names for you is what I'm saying. But there's really wonderful institutions that kind of find this nexus between them, and they're really, really important. Maybe the one that I will mention actually is the IPCC, and even by its name, it's called Intergovernmental Panel, right? And that already suggests to you that it's a really wonderful nexus between science and policy. right? And it needs to be further enabled. We need to trust the science and the recommendations that come out of the body, right? In terms of accountability, well, that's a big question, right? So if the BPs and Shells and Exxons of the world, as we've really recently read in the news, can make billions and billions of dollars in earning off of our shoulders, each and every one of our shoulders over the course of the last 2 years of the financial and energy crisis, more profits than has been seen across 140 years and that kind of stuff, then one really starts to wonder, right? Now, interestingly, if you go to any of their websites, even just the website is green. Even just the color makes you think that they're doing the right thing. So let's, as individuals, hold them accountable too, right? Let's be clear where we park our money. And if it's only 100 rupees that you have in your bank account, but that money is invested somewhere, and it is invested in your big oil and your big gas and your big coal, okay? So be very aware on an individual basis even about your choices, right? And I think the third part I just want to make really quickly is about the language we speak, right? So yes, corporate speaks a different language than academia, and policymakers speak a different language, etc. But we live in the 21st century, and just due to our kind of experience of what we do, right, and that's climate, which is complex and it influences all other sectors. Due to that, already our language needs to be sensitized to all these sectors and ways of working together. And to me, that's actually the fun part of the job, or of the action. And I would really encourage everyone to actually see that as an enabling factor, right? When we learn to collaborate, learn to go out there and learn from and with others. Thanks.
Thank you. Let me start with the fact that uh, let's understand the political system first. After the 18th Amendment, there's a lot of subject that has been dissolved on the provincial level. If we take the climate change, it's a global issue, it's a federal issue, and the ministry is only with the federal. And when we talk about the environmental agencies, they are either on federal and provincial level. Similarly, other department, forestry and other relevant department, water resources, they are also on the provinces level. When we are talking about the international commitments, they are being signed by the federal government, and they are the one who has to report on these international commitments. But when it's come for the data sharing, considering the political situation and considering the political system that we have, there's a lot of lack in the data sharing from all the provinces. It's very difficult for the federal government to take data from Punjab, because the government is some other parties ruling there. It's very difficult for them to take data from the Balochistan, because someone else, and they have other system to do that. So I think this is something that is one of the biggest challenge that we are facing right now, considering that we have international commitment and we have to report on that. We don't have that kind of baseline data on that we can report to anyone that we have been here, and now we have been here and we will be here by 2030. But I think considering the technology, this is the one of the coordination forum that we have been working with the help of all the experts, all the panelists in the pool of experts. The aim is how, using the technology, we can connect all the national provincial assemblies, how we can connect all the environmental protection agencies at federal level and provincial level. Then I will be talking about the capacity. There's again a lot of challenge in the capacity, not only the parliamentarians, with the government, with the bureaucracy, then how to report on this data. What they do, पूरा पूरा दथा पूरा पूरा डॉक्यूमेंट जो है वो हमारे साथ शेयर कर दिया जाता है. Again, फेडरल गवर्नमेंट क्या करती है, इंस्टेड ऑफ जस्ट रीडिंग इट आउट, वो ही उठा के आगे भिजवा देती है. So in the end of the result, they also don't take us seriously. They never take us serious. That's why this is the one of the challenge that we are facing right now. So we I would request the academia and everyone to come up with some idea or a technology that can be a centralized, where all the data can be collected, and at least we have a baseline data from where we can start on building at least we have a target to where to reach by 2030 at least.
I'll just identify one more challenge to different levels of climate action partnerships. And one of the challenges is the way the evolution of norms in a certain domain or certain area takes place. This process is never a linear or a straightforward process, and it suffers many ups and downs. The progress is checkered at best, and it takes a lot of crisis and a lot of serious crisis for norms in a certain domain to solidify and crystallize along certain key issues. While the goals of what needs to be done in terms of carbon zero, carbon neutrality, and other aspects of climate change are clear, yet these goals have not yet achieved the level of norms as exist in the domain of, let's say, the international law on the conduct of war and hostilities. Uh, the evolution of norms is slightly more advanced in the domain of trade and competition. But climate change, unfortunately, is one of those areas where the differential evolution of norms is still moving forward at a slightly slower pace, right? And in this, we cannot fault the institutions. No government, no head of the state, no international organization can be faulted for it. This is something wired in human psyche. And human psyche, and at least the literate human psyche of the last couple of thousands of years, is very dramatic in its approach to the world. Unless something seriously climactic, unless a climax takes place, human beings, let's be very frank about it. I mean, we human beings look at the world like it's a play, and people like legendary playwrights like William Shakespeare they have called the world a play, a stage, and everyone an actor on it. So we look at the world in terms of a drama that is being staged. And I'm not saying it with in a tongue-in-cheek manner. I'm saying it at a very fundamental psychological level. We need something serious to jolt us into waking up and getting down to brass tacks. And I mean, look at our lives. How many of us take a bland diagnosis of, let's say, a sore throat seriously? But when it becomes more serious, something, God forbid, fatal or fateful, it is only then that we wake up and think that, yes, health is something that needs to be taken seriously. So this fundamental psychological orientation, when it becomes implicated in the methodical and institutional ways in which norms evolve, creates a situation in which people cannot walk in the direction of their best intentions. It is for this reason that I don't know the exact thinker, but some 19th century heterodox economic thinker said that the road to hell is paved with good intentions. I mean, nobody wants it like this, but that is how humanity as a whole moves forward. So we need to introspect as well, as one of my co-panelists pointed out, that we also need to speak the right language. We also need to take action at the right level. And we also need to understand how humanity as a whole moves forward. The concept is very similar to the idea of punctuated equilibria in how new species emerge in the process of evolution. For millennia and eons, nothing new, no adaptation takes place, but suddenly some ecological breakdown or some transfer of resources from one niche to another results in the rise of a new species. And this is what worries me, the theatrical, dramatic orientation of human psyche. And may Providence save all of us from it.
Thank you for those insights. I think we have just enough time for one last question. I'd like to request, I'm so sorry, but I've just been told to wrap it up. We're going a little bit over time. So this young lady, I think, has had her hand raised for quite a while. If she could please have the mic.
Okay. I'm
Excuse
Riaz.
me, sorry. She wanted to ask a question.
Okay, please ask.
Thank you so much. If I could request that you please make it short, because and please also specify who you'd like to address the question to.
Assalamu alaikum. My name is Rida, and I'm a climate justice activist and a high school student. My question is for anyone who would like to answer. So, my question is I've seen throughout my 10 years of activism that youth is often ignored while we're taking the decisions. So, my question is what are some of the effective strategies for engaging youth in climate action, and how can these strategies be scaled up to reach more young people, and how can we ensure that youth are given meaningful roles in decision making processes, and their perspectives are not only heard but actually implemented and listened to.
Thank you. Who would like to address that? I see Miriam reaching for her
I
mic.
have two very, very quick inputs, and this is not a full list. The list will be much, much longer. Hopefully, others can add. I think one is education around climate change from a young age and in all subjects, be it maths, be it biology, be it geography, be it religious studies, or whatever else. Okay? And so, when actually then our younger generation is informed and is enabled, which probably needs a bit more than education and awareness raising, they will have a voice more and more. The second that I want to mention is an example that's been implemented in a few European countries, and it's called an ombudsperson for future generations. A few countries in the world have these kinds of persons, and it's a person who sits in legislative offices and functions like any other ombudsperson and actually represents the future generations who do not yet have a voice. So yes, the young generations of today, but also those who don't even have a voice yet, because they're not considered most of the time in our decisions. And that can be another forum for youth to be engaged, and they are in those countries where this person exists. So there must be more answers to your question, though, more hopefully.
Just a very brief intervention. In Pakistan, youth is not necessarily related to an age cohort. In Pakistan, the idea of youth is intimately connected to the idea of not being economically productive. So my advice to the young adults of Pakistan is that make the most of freelancing, learn more than your geriatric peers and your middle-aged peers, and you will become institutionally and socially more influential. Because we have to look at the dynamics of our society. If you are earning, you are an adult. If you're not earning, you don't get a seat at the table. So study hard and work hard before we got to work in our generation.
Thank you. That reminds me, a few years ago, I read about, that was really good. I was attending a talk by someone, and they mentioned that the founder of Alibaba had said that education now has to focus more on employing our youth or training our youth to do in the future what machines will not be able to do. So it kind of reminded me a little bit of that, the employment aspect of it. I'm very sorry. I know some of you had a few questions, and I hope that you're going to stay for the panel after lunch, which continues this discussion with a different set of panelists. So I hope that you'll be able to participate and ask your questions there. I've been asked to wrap up the session. This session has actually left us with a lot more questions than it has answers. And one of the biggest questions that I am going to be taking away from this is partnership only resources at the end of the day? We keep talking about the money and the funding behind it. So essentially, when we talk about partnership, is that actually what we mean? Who's going to be giving us money? Paise kahan se aayenge? Where is the money going to come from? The incentive for the government to partner with the academia, or with, well, the incentive for anyone to partner with the NGOs is because they know that we have donor funding, things like that. So what do we really mean by partnership? I know Amira is going to be moderating the next session. So Amira, maybe you can focus on that question and get an answer for us. On behalf of NUST and on behalf of the German Red Cross, which is one of the co-funders for this event, I'd like to thank all of you very much for being a part of the panel. And I hope we can continue this interaction over lunch. Thank you so much.
Thank you everyone for such an insightful panel discussion. So now I would like to invite